All right, oh, we're good. Okay, once again, we're gonna try this. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to in November, the whatever it is, 18th Civil War Roundtable meeting. Our program this evening is by Sharon Weedin, and it's on Benjamin Grierson and his incredible raid. So Sharon, without further ado, go for it.
Thank you for those that turned up in this wet, rainy night. Before I start on the narrative, I'm going to point some things out on the map for the people that are physically present. And I understand that the rest of you can look at a map that you had made available to you. I just want to point out some of the major things that I'll be talking about during the program. The railroads. We have the Memphis and Charleston Railroad that runs from, surprise, Memphis down into Alabama and cuts through Corinth. The Mississippi Central Railroad, this is the one that Grant made his first try at Vicksburg by proceeding south down that and got unceremoniously had to turn around and go back north. The Mobile and Ohio Railroad, I'll be talking about quite a bit tonight, that runs along north-south along the eastern side of Mississippi. And then the most important railroad for tonight is the Southern Railroad, also called the Vicksburg Railroad, that runs between Vicksburg and Meridian, Mississippi. And then finally, it's all part of the Mississippi Central, but after you cross the Southern Railroad, it becomes known as the New Orleans, Jackson, Great Northern Railroad, and goes from Jackson all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Major cities, we have Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, about halfway down the western side of the state. Jackson, the state capital, and as I mentioned a minute ago, Meridian, and the rest are really small towns. And I'm not going to hop up and point out each of these little towns as I go through this, but I've marked on the map the various towns that were part of the raid or that Grierson camped for the night close by those the towns. All right, before we turn our horses' noses south down the Pontotoc Ridge into the heart of Mississippi, I want to take a minute to talk about what was going on in that part of the Western Theater in the spring of 1863. Since October of 1862, Ulysses Grant had been trying his darndest to get at Vicksburg, perched atop the highest point on the lower Mississippi River. First slide. The large guns at Vicksburg provided the Confederacy with control of a big critical chunk of the Mississippi River, a fact that had to change if the Union was going to win the war. Grant's many and varied efforts to get his army in a position to subdue Vicksburg had all been unsuccessful. By the spring of 1863, Grant had settled on a plan whereby he would move 3 corps of his army south down the Louisiana side of the Mississippi River till they reached a point where they could be transported across the river and come at Vicksburg from the south or east. Grant knew, of course, that transporting huge numbers of men, horses, and materiel across a wide and fast-moving river under fire would be disastrous. He began to consider a plan whereby a cavalry raid could be launched out of Union-held West Tennessee and serve to divert Confederate attention sufficiently to allow him to cross his army over the river unmolested. In January of 1863, the Confederates transferred Earl Van Dorn's 5,000 cavalry troopers out of North Mississippi to the Army of Tennessee. The fortuitous loss of Van Dorn's regular cavalry from the chessboard made a cavalry raid deep into the state of Mississippi an even more attractive option to Union commanders. Grant wrote Major General Stephen Hurlbut, commander of his 16th Corps, in mid-February that a raid might, quote, cut the railroad east of Jackson, Mississippi. The undertaking would be a hazardous one, but it would pay well if carried out. It seems to me that Grierson, with about 500 picked men, might succeed in making his way south. Grierson was told about the planned raid in early 1863, and planning for the raid began in earnest. Second slide. Benjamin Henry Grierson was born on July 8, 1826, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father was a storekeeper and a cobbler. When Benjamin was 3, the family moved to Youngstown in Northeast Ohio. His father ran a successful mercantile business, and the family enjoyed a middle-class life that included enjoyment of the arts, especially music. When Grierson was 8 years old, the horse he was riding bolted, and Grierson had to hold on for dear life. Grierson wrote in his memoir that he enjoyed the ride because the horse was going so fast. Once the horse stopped and Grierson dismounted, however, it kicked Grierson full force in the 8-year-old's face. The kick opened a gash, temporarily blinded the boy, and knocked him unconscious. He remained in a coma for several days. Grierson's face was badly disfigured from the blow, which is why he wore a beard as soon as he could grow one. Apparently, there is a dispute among historians as to the long-term effect this horse incident had on the future cavalryman, but he obviously overcame any lasting fear of horses. Grierson became enamored with his future wife, Alice, when they were teenagers in Youngstown. Her father squelched the budding relationship because Grierson did not appear to have great economic prospects. He drank some and chewed tobacco. He also was not a churchgoer. So Alice's father sent her away to school for 3 years. When she returned, Alice had the same objections to marrying Grierson as her father had. Third slide, please. Then Grierson's family seemed to settle the matter by moving from Youngstown to Jacksonville in west central Illinois. His father opened another successful store there. Alice followed shortly thereafter, moving to Springfield, Illinois, to teach. Alice eventually overcame her objections to the union, and the pair married in September of 1854. They had 2 sons before the outbreak of the Civil War. While Alice never fully reconciled herself to Benjamin's occasional drinking, chewing, and refusal to go to church, they were, by all accounts, a devoted couple. Grierson and a friend had borrowed money, including from Alice's father, to open a store just west of Jacksonville. The store failed in 1860, sending Grierson and his family back to his parents' house, which did not thrill Alice. Grierson was a progressive outlier in west central Illinois. He joined the Republican Party after it formed in the mid-1850s and soon let it be known that he was an abolitionist. Grierson had a knack for making the right friends. Fourth slide. Abraham Lincoln spent a night in the Grierson home while traveling for the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Richard Yates, Civil War governor of Illinois, was a native of Jacksonville and had become acquainted with Grierson before the war. During his teen and early adult years, music was a constant in Grierson's life. He started with the flute and soon became proficient on the guitar, clarinet, piano, and violin. He conducted the Springfield Band in Illinois' capital and wrote campaign ditties for Lincoln. Grierson could rely on income from giving music lessons when his storekeeping endeavors proved unprofitable. When war seemed inevitable, Grierson began reading about military tactics. Once Fort Sumter opened hostilities, he decided to go to Springfield to see what his friend, Governor Yates, might have for him to do in the war effort. On the train, as he made his way to Springfield, Grierson made the acquaintance of a small, ordinary-looking man heading to Springfield on the same mission, Ulysses Grant. All Yates offered Grierson was an unpaid position as a message carrier, which Grierson accepted despite Alice's concerns given their straitened fiscal circumstances. Governor Yates sent Grierson to Cairo, Illinois with a pouch of papers for Benjamin Prentiss, of later Hornet's Nest fame at Shiloh. Prentiss was so pleased that the pouch contained his general's commission that he offered Grierson an unpaid position on his staff. Grierson accepted, but grew increasingly unhappy with Prentiss, particularly when Prentiss behaved badly toward Ulysses Grant when he lost a dispute over rank with Grant. Finally, Yates appointed Grierson a major in the 6th Illinois Cavalry, which mustered in at Camp Butler in Springfield in November of 1861. Grierson drilled his men into an effective fighting force and earned their respect and loyalty. The 6th initial colonel was a political appointee and not at all interested in the work necessary to officer the regiment. He left in disgrace in the spring, and after Grierson's battalion was the only one that displayed any martial ability during a regimental review, Yates promoted him to colonel of the 6th Illinois Cavalry. Eventually, the regiment ended up in Memphis, Tennessee. Over the summer, fall, and winter of 1862-63, it conducted numerous small raids into northern Mississippi against Confederate cavalry. Sherman became familiar with and impressed by Grierson's work. Grant also was aware of Grierson's successes and recommended him for promotion to brigadier general in February of 1863, a pay bump that Grierson was not to achieve until after the raid. Once Grant decided that a cavalry raid deep into Mississippi would provide an excellent diversion from his activities on the western side of the Mississippi, planning got underway. Grierson's two immediate superiors in Memphis and northern Mississippi were Major Stephen Hurlbut and Brigadier General William Suey Smith. Hurlbut's headquarters was in Memphis, and Smith's was in LaGrange, Tennessee, which Grierson and his cavalrymen also called home. Grant, Hurlbut, Smith, and Grierson collaborated in the early months of 1863 to put together the plan for Grierson's raid. It was decided that Grierson would lead a brigade of cavalry consisting of his own 6th Illinois, the 7th Illinois Cavalry, the 2nd Iowa Cavalry, and Smith's Illinois battery of 6 2-pounder Woodruff guns. The troopers of the 6th and 7th Illinois and part of the 2nd Iowa carried Sharps carbines and pistols on the raid. The rest of the 2nd Iowa carried Colt's revolving rifles and pistols. The 6th Illinois, try saying that real fast, fielded 500 men, and inasmuch as its colonel, Grierson, was leading the brigade, the 6th was led by Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Loomis. The 7th Illinois Cavalry counted 542 troopers. Its men were drawn from all over Illinois. The 7th Illinois spent a number of months in Cape Girardeau protecting garrisons and Union-loving locals, as well as participating in John Pope's campaign against New Madrid and Island Number 10. They took part in Halleck's slow advance from the Shiloh battlefield to Corinth. The 7th Illinois Cavalry fought at Iuka and Corinth, suffering the loss of 40 men killed and wounded in those battles. Colonel Edward Prince commanded the 7th. The 2nd Iowa Cavalry mustered into service in Davenport, Iowa in September of 1861. The regiment's initial colonel was a West Pointer who turned the command into one of the best trained cavalry regiments in the Union Army, according to author Tim Smith. And a good deal of my reading on this comes from Mr. Smith's book. The 2nd Iowa was the largest of the regiments in Grierson's brigade with 600 men. Like the 7th Illinois, the 2nd Iowa participated in Pope's, New Madrid, and Island No. 10 campaign, then moved southeast to join the fights in northern Mississippi. The summer and fall of 1862 found the 2nd Iowa with a brigade led by Sherman just south of Corinth near Rienzi. The 2nd Iowa also fought at Corinth and Iuka. When its first colonel was promoted to command John Pope's cavalry, Edward Hatch became the 2nd Iowa's new colonel. Hatch attended Vermont's Norwich Military Academy and was a very solid officer, as were Reuben Loomis and Edward Prince, the other regimental leaders on the raid. The only artillery to go on the raid was Smith's Battery K of the 1st Illinois Artillery, commanded by Captain Jason B. Smith. Captain Smith was older than most of the raid's men, as he was in his, I've read it 2 different ways, either he was in his mid-50s or early 60s at the time of the raid. He was a Methodist Episcopal pastor before the war. There were 6 2-pounder Woodruff guns in the battery. The guns were steel tubes weighing 150 pounds each. They shot 2-pound round shot and canister. The battery's cannon and carriage required 2 horses to pull. 2 additional horses were needed to haul the limbers holding the ammunition chests. So you can see that this artillery was much better suited for a fast-moving cavalry brigade than our artillery in most Civil War armies. The brigade departed from LaGrange, Tennessee to commence the raid. LaGrange is located just north of Tennessee's southern border with Mississippi and about halfway between Memphis and Corinth. Union troops had established a presence in the town for some time, both to protect the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, which ran through the town, and as a jumping off point for Union forays into northern Mississippi. As part of the overall plan to divert rebel attention away from what Grant was doing on the Louisiana side of the Mississippi, other raids were put into motion at roughly the same time that Grierson's commenced. Stephen Hurlbut and Suey Smith knew approximately when Grant hoped to cross the Mississippi, and Grierson was also aware of Grant's plans. No one, including Grant at this point, knew where he would attempt the crossing, although everyone, including Grant, assumed it would be Grand Gulf. The overall goal was to time the diversions to commence shortly before Grant's ferrying of his men across the river, so that the Confederates were thinking about something other than what Grant was doing. So in mid-April, 2 incursions into northwest Mississippi, one by the 12th Wisconsin Infantry and a cavalry force led by Suey Smith himself, set forth from Tennessee south into northern Mississippi. These relatively short runs into Mississippi were the sort of exercise Grierson had been conducting for the past year or so. They were successful in as much as they occupied Brigadier General James Chalmers, who commanded what little regular Confederate cavalry was left in northwest Mississippi after Van Dorn left to face his day of reckoning in Middle Tennessee. Brigadier General Daniel Ruggles commanded Confederate forces in northeast and east Mississippi, but he relied primarily on state militia, which lacked the discipline and training of regulars. The The exception was Lieutenant Colonel Clark Marteau's 2nd Tennessee Cavalry. Nathan Bedford Forrest and his superb.
Sorry.
I left that one out. Nathan Bedford Forrest and his superb cavalry had been drawn away by another raid, timed to coincide with Grierson's Able Strike's mule march across northern Alabama and into Georgia. Alice. Benjamin Grierson very nearly missed leading his brigade on the raid through Mississippi. After earlier planned starts in February and March were called off, Grierson wrangled a furlough from his boss, General Hurlbut, to go home in early April to visit his wife and 2 boys. Home was, of course, Jacksonville, Illinois, so a long way from LaGrange, Tennessee, where the brigade was awaiting word to go. Grierson arrived at his home on April 6th. While he was there, Grant was in Louisiana making final plans for crossing the Mississippi. Rosecrans was in Middle Tennessee working on the Strike Mule Raid, and Hurlbut was in Memphis making final plans for the lesser raids, as well as Grierson's. Grant finally ordered that Grierson's brigade was to start at the crack of dawn on April 17th. If Grierson was not back in time, Colonel Hatch of the 2nd Iowa was to lead the raid. Grierson was handed a telegram at his home in Jacksonville on April 13, telling him to return immediately. He took a train to St. Louis from Jacksonville, rode a steamboat from there to Memphis, then hopped aboard a special train Hurlbut had waiting to take him to LaGrange. He arrived about sundown on the 16th. Before Grierson left Memphis, General Hurlbut gave him a final briefing on where Grant and his army were and a rundown of what he was expected to do. And this is it in a nutshell. A few days into the ride, Grierson was to send one of his 3 regiments east to damage the Mobile and Ohio Railroad between Tupelo and West Point. I'm going to point this out. Here's the Mobile in Ohio, there's Tupelo, and there's West Point. So something like that. He was to send a 2nd regiment west to damage the Mississippi Central Railroad. Each of those regiments was then to make its way back to LaGrange as best it was able. Grierson was to continue south with his remaining regiment to the Southern Railroad, hit it east of Jacksonville. Here's the Southern, here's Jackson, and do as much damage to it as possible. The dual goals for the raid were to disrupt the Southern Railroad to prevent supplies from reaching Vicksburg and to divert Confederate attention away from Grant. There was disagreement about where Grierson was to go after he disrupted the Southern Railroad. Hurlbut ordered Grierson to return to Southern Tennessee by way of a loop, if necessary, up the western side of Alabama. Sooy Smith and Grierson preferred to leave the decision to Grierson's discretion as conditions at the time directed. Smith told Grierson to use his discretion and follow the course he thought best, and that he, Smith, would take the consequences for disobedience of orders if it came to that. When the 1,700 men of Grierson's brigade rode out of LaGrange just before dawn on April 17, 1863, Grierson's men did not know where they were going or how long they would be gone. Apparently, the regimental commanders, Colonels Hatch and Prince and Lieutenant Colonel Loomis, were also in the dark. Virtually the only person besides Grierson riding out of LaGrange that morning who was familiar with the overall plan for the raid was Lieutenant Samuel Sandy Woodward, Grierson's adjutant. Grierson and Woodward forged such a productive and cordial relationship that Woodward followed Grierson to Texas after the Civil War to serve as his adjutant when Grierson was colonel in the 10th U.S. Cavalry, one of the new black regiments. He stayed with Grierson until Grierson retired from the Army in 1890. The only personal effects Grierson carried with him on the raid were his Jew's harp, a small compass, and Colton's pocket map of Mississippi. Crucially, Grierson also had with him a report compiled by a Union scout some 3 months previously. The report described the best route for Grierson to follow, which for the most part, Grierson did follow, where forage and provisions could be found, and Confederate defenses. So far as I have read, the scout was never identified, but his report was invaluable to Grierson. A day's hard riding brought Grierson's men to a halt just north of Ripley, Mississippi. They camped for the night at a plantation, a practice Grierson would follow throughout the raid. His men would empty the smokehouses and barns for food for themselves and horses, and even switch their worn-out horses for those of the plantation owners as need be. Although food was considered fair game for the raiders, Grierson's raid was unique among Civil War raids in that Grierson made clear to his men at the outset that privately owned property was not to be taken or destroyed, and to a remarkable degree, that order was complied with. Food and horses were another matter, although the Army's worn-out horses were usually left behind. Any Confederate material was burned, but it was not unusual for Grierson's men to assist locals in putting out fires if they spread to private property. On the second day of the raid, Grierson divided his command into 3 groups as they neared the next town of any size, New Albany, and the Tallahatchie River. Grierson was expecting Confederate resistance to his crossing of the river, and he hoped at least one of the 3 groups would get across unmolested and be able to come up on the rebel flank if there was an attack on either of the 2 other groups. Grierson also wanted the divided command to locate and destroy Confederate recruiting camps said to be in the area. The crossing of the Tallahatchie was accomplished with little resistance. The men, minus the 2nd Iowa, camped at a plantation 4 miles south of New Albany. The plantation's owner went into a rage over the foodstuffs taken by Grierson's men, more so than about anyone else on the raid who suffered a like indignity, but was placated when Grierson showed him the horses and mules they were leaving behind. Grierson deviated from his push south the next morning by again sending smaller groups of men out into the countryside. One group went to find Hatch and the Iowans, who the day before had been sent to the east to cross the river and had not yet reconnected with the main column. They found each other and returned after skirmishing with Confederates at a small camp where the rebels were organizing recruits. It had started raining hard and continued into the 3rd day of the raid. They stopped for the night 5 miles south of the town of Pontotoc, having covered only 15 to 16 miles due to the side excursions and heavy rain. That evening, Grierson personally inspected each soldier and every horse in his command. He designated about 200 men of the 1,700 who rode out of LaGrange as not physically up to the strenuous ride ahead, and told them he was sending them and the horses Grierson deemed too spent to continue back to LaGrange. The returning group, christened the Quinine Brigade and led by the 2nd Iowa's Major Love, were given one of the 2-pounders from Smith's battery, as well as all the prisoners who had been captured to that point. Major Love was told to backtrack over the route they had already traversed in an effort to convince the locals and any Confederates who might be watching that the whole force was returning to LaGrange after yet another short foray into Mississippi. The Quinine Brigade made it back safely to Tennessee 2 days later. On day 4, Grierson took some liberty with that part of his order, requiring him to send one of his regiments west to tear up the Mississippi Central Railroad and cut the telegraph wires. Grierson knew that a couple of the bridges used by that line had not been repaired after damage done by prior raiders, rendering the railroad useless from somewhere around Oxford. He did not want to lose an entire regiment to a task that did not need doing, so he assigned one man, a scout, to ride the 35 miles to the Mississippi Central and cut the telegraph wires. That man was to then ride back to Union lines in Tennessee with a message from Grierson explaining his decision. The rest of Grierson's column continued south. As they approached Houston, Grierson sent a few of his men through the town, but the rest rode through fields east of town and rejoined the others on the road south of town. Grierson said he did so to confuse the townsfolk and prevent them from counting how many men he had with him. They stopped for the night about 12 miles south of Houston. Grierson may not have known it at first, but Confederate cavalry, not state militia, was trailing him and suffering some near misses against parts of Grierson's brigade. Clark Bartow, who grew up around Cleveland, Ohio, moved to the South in the 1850s and stayed. At the time of Grierson's raid, he was lieutenant colonel of the 2nd Tennessee Cavalry and tasked with watching federal movements in North Mississippi. When Bartow learned that a large federal cavalry force left LaGrange and headed into Mississippi, several companies of state militia and some partisan rangers joined him in pursuing them. Colonel Hatch in the 2nd Iowa had skirmished with these men on the 2nd and 3rd days of the raid when Grierson split up his force in front of the Tallahatchie. By chasing Hatch and the 2nd Iowa, Bartow unknowingly moved away from Grierson's main column. Then Bartow barely missed snagging the Quinine Brigade as it made its way north back to LaGrange. Bartow's exhausted men from running around then headed south on Grierson's trail. The 5th day of the raid was pivotal to its success or failure. By this time, Grierson was aware that a sizable force of Confederate cavalry was a matter of hours behind his column. He was also close to a literal fork in the road that required a major decision. Apparently, for the first time, Grierson explained to Colonel Edward Hatch of the 2nd Iowa that when they reached the fork in the road, with the right fork leading to the towns of Montpelier and Starkville, and the left fork to Columbus and the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, Grierson was ordering Hatch and the Iowans to the left, and everyone else was going to the right to continue down to the Southern Railroad. Grierson informed Hatch that he was to strike the Mobile and Ohio Railroad in the vicinity of West Point, tear up rails and cut telegraph wires, continue south along the line, ripping up rails, then turn north and hit Columbus, Mississippi, if possible, then head back to LaGrange. Grierson offered Hatch one of the Woodruff guns from Smith's battery. But before following the left fork, Grierson wanted the 2nd Iowa to follow his Illinois regiments for 4 miles down their fork of the road, then turn around and ride back so that they would obliterate Grierson's tracks to throw off the trailing Confederates. Colonel Hatch, who was not crazy about any of this, because not somewhat surprisingly to me, all of these guys really wanted to be on this raid and see it through to the end. I would have been saying, no, I'll go back. But Hatch, who had been told that part of the reason Grierson chose his regiment for this task was because the Second Iowa's horses were in worse shape than the others, pointed out that a battalion could follow Grierson for 4 miles and accomplish what Grierson wanted without further tiring the whole regiment. Grierson agreed to that, but did decide to take with him the only doctor on the raid, a Second Iowa man. So while the rest of the Second Iowa waited at the fork, the Iowa battalion did a great job making it look like men hauling a gun came up from the road to Starkville, then turned toward Columbus and the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Sure enough, when Bartow and his men reached the fork a very short time after the Iowans headed east, they followed after the Second Iowa and not the Illinois regiments. It did not take long for Bartow's men to ride up on the Iowans. A very brisk firefight ensued, but an opening allowed the Iowans to head northwest toward Union lines in Tennessee. Hatch had learned that the Mobile and Ohio line in West Point was very well defended, and that his regiment, whose numbers had been depleted by the excising of 2nd Iowa men to the Quinine Brigade, another sore point with Colonel Hatch, because it was primarily 2nd Iowa men that got sent back, was greatly outnumbered by the Confederates defending the town and railroad. Colonel Hatch, however, also realized, being the professional that he was, that a big part of his mission was to decoy rebels away from Grierson's column. He did so by fighting a rear guard action designed to keep the Confederates in pursuit of the 2nd Iowa. Hatch's men moved north along the line of the Mobile and Ohio, tearing up track when Bartow's pursuit allowed. The Iowans finally turned west when north of Tupelo and headed for LaGrange. Bartow followed them, skirmishing with the Iowans until they reached Ripley. From Ripley, Hatch's men rode back to LaGrange without further harassment from Bartow. The 2nd Iowa lost 10 men on a remarkable side raid. Once he got back to LaGrange, Confederate officers reported to the brass that Union cavalry had been driven out of Mississippi. Little did they know what was to come. Grierson's column was now reduced to 950 from the 1,700 men of the 6th and 7th Illinois Cavalry and the 4 remaining tubes in Smith's Illinois Battery. Notice that the entire Union brigade was now made up of Illinoisans. After Hatch's Iowans took the left fork in the road, the Illinoisans headed south to Starkville. By this point in the raid, Grierson's men were often mistaken as Confederates when they entered a town because their uniforms and themselves were so mud-encrusted and haggard-looking. That, plus no one expected Yankees so far south in Mississippi. One miller at a grist mill that the men stopped at to get fodder for the horses asked Grierson, who he had not identified as a Yankee, why he didn't go after Grierson instead of bothering him. Most Mississippians were aware that a man named Grierson was carrying out a big cavalry raid in their state. The men rode another 4 to 5 miles beyond Starkville, then for the first time since the raid began, did not camp at a plantation. They slept wherever they could find a semi-dry spot in the miserably wet and swampy terrain. About this time in the raid, the 7th Illinois Quartermaster Sergeant, Richard W. Serby, came up with a way to assist Grierson. Serby, born in Canada but living in the United States at the war's outset, wrote in his memoir, quote, "Possessed of a venturesome disposition, I naturally wanted to be in the front, and it occurred to me I could do so. I immediately suggested my ideas to Lieutenant Colonel Blackburn of having some scouts in the advance, dressed in citizens' clothes, so they could by proper management gain much valuable information, although not without running some danger." Sort of an understatement there. While The 7th Illinois Lieutenant Colonel William Blackburn agreed it was a great idea and took it to Grierson, who also agreed. Blackburn chose the 6 or 7 men who would become the scouts, informed Serby that he was in charge of the squad, and instructed him to keep in advance of the column by a quarter mile to 2 miles, obtain all information respecting the roads, their destination, distances and condition, and also that of the streams, bridges, and whereabouts of Confederates. The squad spread out and procured civilian clothes, saddles, shotguns, and Confederate uniforms for emergencies. The squad, soon called the Butternut Guerrillas, would precede the Federals into towns to perform reconnaissance, search out forage, and provided other invaluable service to Grierson. On the 6th day of the raid, as Grierson's troopers made their way south from below Starkville toward Louisville, Grierson split off yet another contingent from his remaining force. He had no way of knowing whether Hatch had succeeded in tearing up the Mobile and Ohio track, so he asked for volunteers to ride east and do that job. When no one volunteered, he told Colonel Prince to pick a company from the 7th Illinois for the mission. Prince chose the company B that happened to be at the rear of the column that day. Company B was led by Captain Henry Forbes. Forbes' 36 men included his 18-year-old brother Stephen, who had already in this war been wounded and taken prisoner in the fighting around Corinth. He had obviously been exchanged since then and was back in a Union uniform. Forbes' orders were to ride east to Macon, break up the railroad as much as they could, cut the telegraph wires, then ride back and rejoin the main column. Of course, no one could tell Captain Forbes where Grierson would be, as the main column would continue south to the Southern Railroad, and Grierson himself had not decided where he would take the troopers after their task of destruction was done. Once Forbes got his 35 men within 3 miles of Macon, he learned from the 3 Butternut guerrillas he had taken with him that the little town was occupied by 2 cavalry regiments, an infantry regiment, and a section of artillery. Forbes knew an attack by his 36 men was out of the question. Forbes thought about burning a nearby railroad bridge, but it was crawling with rebels. He couldn't even get close enough to cut the telegraph. Still, word of Forbes' approach had deceived the Confederate brass into believing they were a much larger contingent and drew Confederate troops to the area and away from the Southern Railroad, a huge benefit to Grierson. Forbes turned around and headed southwest in what Grierson and others believed in all candor would be an impossible task, finding and reconnecting with Grierson. Grierson's main column rode through Louisville without any disturbances and rode another 10 miles south. When Grierson called for a halt, the men did not realize the stop was to rest and feed the horses, and that they would be back on the road after a couple of hours. As they were getting closer to their goal, the Southern Railroad, Grierson grew increasingly anxious about getting to Newton Station, their particular target, before Confederate officials could figure out what he was doing and fortify it. So there was little rest for the weary that night or the next night either, for that matter, as Grierson got closer to his goal. But first, on the raid's 7th day, Grierson's troopers had to get through Philadelphia. I don't know why there was not imagination apparently amongst the town's namers in Mississippi, because we got Louisville, we got Houston, we got Philadelphia. As they approached, it appeared as though a line of regular Confederate infantry was blocking their way. The line turned out to be local citizens who melted away as it became apparent they were not going to scare the Federal cavalry off. Philadelphians were much pleased when Grierson's men cleared the town without burning or pillaging their property. Another obstacle faced the weary cavalrymen was crossing the Pearl River, their first major river since the Tallahatchie. Some locals were preparing to burn the bridge as Grierson's scouts rode up, preserving the way for the horses and men to stay dry when crossing the river. On the day after Grierson sent Captain Forbes and Company B to Macon, he again became concerned about fulfilling that part of his order that required him to do damage to the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. So this time he sent just two men, Captain John Lynch and Trooper Pollard, to Macon with the same order: tear up the railroad and cut the telegraph lines. These two had no more success than Hatch or Forbes' men had had. They ran into a group of Confederates west of the town, gathered information from them while purporting to be Confederates themselves, then bluffed their way back the way they'd come. Like Hatch and Forbes, Lynch quickly realized the order was impossible to fulfill because of the large number of Confederates who were posted in the area. The Southern Railroad was the primary object of Grierson's raid. It ran 135 miles from Meridian, Mississippi to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Unlike every other railroad in Mississippi, it ran entirely through Confederate-held territory. At Meridian, the Southern linked with the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, which ran down to Mobile, Alabama, and its port on the Gulf of Mexico. So it was obviously a vital conduit for supplying Vicksburg and all of Mississippi. Vicksburg was dependent on the Southern Railroad for large shipments of food, ammunition, and troop movements, inasmuch as the Mississippi River was controlled by the Union to the north of town and was partially held by Union gunboats to the south. The other railroad that ran into Vicksburg, the Mississippi Central, ran north into Union-held territory and lacked bridges over some rivers due to earlier raids. John Pemberton, Confederate commander of the area raided by Grierson, was well aware of the importance of the Southern Railroad to his mandate to retain Vicksburg in Confederate control. Although Pemberton knew that Grierson was raiding south down the state, he really did not pay that much attention to what was happening until the attack on Newton Station. In the pre-dawn hours of April 24, the 9th day of the raid, Grierson's men had been without more than a couple hours of sleep for more than 48 hours. They were about 12 miles north of their destination, Newton Station, when Captain Lynch and Trooper Pollard trotted up to the column. Grierson was astounded because he really had not expected they would make it back, much less in such a short time. The pair was said to have ridden for 2 days and nights without interruption. Grierson sent Lieutenant Colonel Blackburn, the guy that Serby had talked to about establishing the Butternut guerrillas, and 2 battalions of the 7th Illinois, along with 3 Butternut guerrillas, including Sergeant Serby, ahead of the rest of the column by about an hour's ride. Just north of Newton Station, Blackburn paused and sent Serby and the 2 Butternuts into the little town to reconnoiter. The village consisted of the railroad depot, a Confederate hospital with auxiliary buildings, and a few other buildings. Serby learned from a local that 2 trains were expected momentarily, one from the east and one from the west. There were no Confederate soldiers, aside from the convalescents in the hospital, defending the town. About as soon as Serby learned this information, Lieutenant Colonel Blackburn and his 2 battalions swooped into town. Serby quickly got them concealed behind buildings, and when the trains rolled into town, Blackburn's men jumped up to the cabs and removed the engineers and firemen. Then Blackburn and his men began their work of destruction. They burned what they could and packed the locomotives with explosives and blew them up. Grierson arrived with the 6th Illinois and the rest of the 7th about an hour into the process. He sent a battalion to the east to destroy bridges along the tracks and did the same for the bridges to the west. By the time Grierson pulled out of town at 2 p.m., a large quantity of commissary and quartermaster's stores, about 500 stand of arms, 2 locomotives, 40 rail cars, and railroad equipment had been destroyed. Clearly, Grierson accomplished one prong of his order. He had destroyed much Confederate property and disrupted the operation of the Southern Railroad. The other desired outcome from Grierson's raid was to confuse and divert the attention of the Confederate High Command from what Grant was doing on the west side of the Mississippi. John Pemberton had been only mildly bothered by Grierson's activities before he struck Newton Station. After the attack, however, 64 of Pemberton's 69 official communications between April 24 and 28 concerned Grierson. Shortly after dawn on April 30, 1863, Grant's troops began crossing the Mississippi River, debarking on the Mississippi side without opposition from Confederate forces. When Grierson's troops moved south out of Newton Station, Grierson mulled over his options. He was hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. His force was reduced to his 6th Illinois and the 7th Illinois, less Company B, inasmuch as Forbes Company B had not been heard from. His men and horses were exhausted, having had little rest over the preceding 2 days. What were his options? He could comply with General Hurlbut's order and move east into Alabama, then north-northeast back to LaGrange. He could continue south and west toward Union-held territory in Louisiana. He could backtrack north along the same route they had followed down from Tennessee, or he could move west and hope to link up with Grant, assuming that he had crossed the Mississippi River. Grierson quickly rejected the Alabama route option. He was leery of the Confederate cavalry, including Forrest, who could be redirected from Middle Tennessee to corner him. He likewise rejected going back the way they came, as he very correctly surmised that Confederate infantry and cavalry were already lined up to confront him in that direction. Grierson decided to head west and let developments determine the course of the troopers. The first stop after Newton Station was a small village named Garlandville. To the Illinoisans' surprise, a line of mostly older men stood between the Union cavalry and the town. Grierson, following his usual practice, sent an advance group toward the town. The home guards fired, wounding a trooper and a horse. A larger group of cavalrymen had better luck, and when they realized Grierson was not going to burn the town or shoot anyone, everyone parted amicably. The column moved on another 10 miles and stopped for the night west of the hamlet of Montrose. The Union cavalrymen had earned their rest. In the preceding 40 hours, they had covered 80 miles, with the longest stop being to destroy military property and the railroad at Newton Station. Grierson let the men sleep in. They didn't resume the march till 8 a.m. the next morning. They rode at a somewhat leisurely pace, covering only 17 miles for the day, with Grierson hoping the men and horses would get a second wind from the slower pace. That night, which was the night of the 9th day of the raid, Grierson sent one of his butternut guerrillas on a mission to the northwest. He was to cut the telegraph along the Southern Railroad and burn any bridges or trestles he came across, which seems to me like a lot to ask of one guy. But the butternut, named Samuel Nelson, headed out and eventually ran into Confederate cavalry sent out by John Pemberton himself to find Grierson and ambush him. The captain leading the rebel cavalry, Hiram Love, interrogated Nelson, who told them he was a local, had been captured and forced to guide the Yankees, that they numbered 1,800 Union troopers and were riding toward the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Now, these guys all deserved Oscars because every Confederate that they encountered during this raid, they took on the role of a local Confederate or a Confederate soldier or cavalryman, and they pulled the wool over their eyes every time. Once Nelson was released and was confident the rebel horsemen were headed east toward the Mobile and Ohio, he returned to alert Grierson what had happened. The Confederates were getting closer to nabbing their prey. Grierson was very pleased with his butternut and said in his memoir, quote, "When he first met them, they were on the direct road to our camp, and had they not been turned from their course, would have come up with us before daylight." Grierson came to a decision regarding his route of escape that night. He decided to make a rapid march, cross the Pearl River, this is for the second time, and strike the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad at Hazelhurst, and after destroying as much of it as possible, try to get on the Confederate flank and cooperate with Grant's forces if they had succeeded in getting past Grand Gulf and Port Gibson. Grierson, of course, had no way of knowing that Grand Gulf had been bypassed as the landing spot for the Federals, or that Grant was still 4 days from commencing the move across the river. The run-in by the Butternut Nelson with Pemberton's cavalry spurred Grierson's men on. They were back in the saddle and headed to Raleigh early the next morning, the 10th day of the raid. They crossed the Leaf River and burned the bridge behind them. 3 companies of Home Guards met them in Raleigh, but lacking ammunition, they posed no threat. The fact that Home Guards were there at all, waiting, was a strong signal to Grierson that his column's whereabouts were becoming known. The Federals continued on for about 30 miles through a dense pine forest. As they approached the Strong River, the 7th Illinois rode ahead to reconnoiter the bridge. As the 6th Illinois stayed behind to take a breather, a cheer made its way up the column to Grierson. A very disheveled trio of men then presented themselves to the colonel, and one of the men said, "Captain Forbes presents his compliments and begs to be allowed to burn his bridges for himself." It was Stephen Forbes, younger brother of Captain Henry Forbes of Company B, 7th Illinois Cavalry, the group sent off by Grierson 4 days earlier to smash the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. The 3 men had been sent ahead by Captain Forbes to alert Grierson they were coming and to get him to stop burning the river bridges, as doing so made their trek all the more difficult. The 4-day saga of Company B was remarkable. Recall that they were told to ride 30+ miles to the east from Grierson's column and do what damage they could to the railroad and telegraph. They were then to return to Grierson's command, but no one could tell Captain Forbes where Grierson would be. Colonel Prince, Captain Forbes' immediate superior officer, could give Forbes no directions for finding Grierson beyond his belief that after their work of destruction on the Southern Railroad, Grierson would turn east into Alabama. So once Forbes realized he had no possibility of getting at the Mobile and Ohio, he began riding southwest in the hope of rejoining Grierson. Company B passed through a still smoldering Newton Station at about 2 a.m., 12 hours after Grierson's column cleared the village. Then, following Colonel Prince's hunch, Forbes led his 36 men southeast out of Newton till he approached the town of Enterprise, Mississippi. Now, notice I've not said anything about Enterprise, Mississippi And that's because it's east from where Grierson and his men were going. Unfortunately for Company B, Enterprise had been reinforced by 2 regiments in addition to the 1 regiment already there. 3,000 rebels versus his 36 men. Captain Forbes grabbed a handkerchief from a nearby clothesline and attached it to his sword. As he rode toward a stockade, 3 Confederates approached and asked, "To what are we indebted for the honor of this visit?" Captain Forbes boldly replied, "We came from Major General Grierson to demand the surrender of Enterprise." Forbes gave Grierson a promotion to add gravitas to his demand. The Confederates asked for an hour to take the demand back for consideration. Forbes said he'd take the request back to Grierson and return with his answer. Forbes turned around and once he was out of hearing range, ordered his men to leave forthwith. The Confederates' infantry regiments were unable to catch up. Major General William Loring, headquartered in nearby Meridian, commanded the troops trying to corral the Union raiders. It was reported to him that several waves of Federals passed through Newton Station, including 500 men in the middle of the night, when the number was closer to 35. The fact that Forbes led his little troop east threw the Confederates for a loop, as well as did the lack of cavalry, Confederate cavalry, to join in the chase. Although the Federals had crossed the Strong River and were celebrating the news regarding Forbes and his company, the decision was made to continue on to the next hurdle, the Pearl River, before stopping for the night. The way across the Pearl was by ferry boat, which was tied up on the far side of the Pearl when Colonel Prince's men pulled up. Prince had a small contingent of the 200 men with him show themselves to the ferryman. The ferryman hailed them, asking if they wanted to cross. Prince hollered back that they were the 1st Alabama Cavalry and would indeed like to cross. Prince managed to get both of the battalions with him across and fed breakfast by the ferryman. By that time, Grierson was on the far bank with the rest of the men. They were all ferried across in 41 trips at 24 horses and riders a load, not counting the artillery, forage wagons, and ambulances. The rest of Forbes Company B pulled up just as the last of Grierson's men were ferried over. Remember that they were behind the 3 that first reached Grierson's column, so they had finally caught up. Henry Forbes was rightfully proud of his Company B and later wrote, "We had been absent 5 days and 4 nights. We had marched fully 300 miles in 10 different counties, had captured and paroled 40 prisoners, confronted and evaded several thousand Confederate troops at Macon and Enterprise, slipped through the home guards of 6 county towns, been twice misled and once lost, had 5 bridges burned in our faces, and in all this time had but 18 hours of sleep, while rations for man and horse had been for the most part conspicuous for their absence. We had not had time to eat." Nor was there time to celebrate the return of Company B. While Grierson was breakfasting with locals on the west side of the Pearl under the guise of an officer in the 1st Alabama Cavalry, one of his troopers came in and said something to him about the 6th Illinois Cavalry. Several locals quickly got up and left, and Grierson knew it was only a short matter of time before riders would get the information about his location to a telegraph operator. Grierson dispatched a couple of his butternuts to Hazelhurst, a railroad town along the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern line, about 15 miles from where they were, to send a telegraph in the name of a rebel colonel to Pemberton. The message was to be that the Yankees had reached the Pearl River, but had been unable to cross because the ferry had been destroyed and were therefore riding northeast. Grierson also dispatched 2 battalions from Prince's 7th Illinois to Hazelhurst, but before they got there, a prisoner who had escaped from Grierson's custody recognized the butternuts and alerted the citizens of their true identity. A shootout ensued, but the locals left in a hurry when Prince's and then the rest of Grierson's men thundered into town. The Federals destroyed military property, had a lunch prepared by the local hotel, and barely missed capturing a train pulling into town. The engineer spotted men tearing up track and wisely reversed its engines in time to save it. Grierson pulled his men out of the town around sunset and headed west. They stopped for the night along Bayou Pierre, a name some of you will recognize from the Battle of Port Gibson. In point of fact, Grierson and his men were only about 30 miles from where Grant's men would come ashore on the east side of the river, but would not do so for another 2 days. Joining up with Grant's army was still Grierson's first choice of ways to end the raid. If they were to attempt that outcome, it would all come down to timing. Grierson still believed Grant would cross at Grand Gulf. If he and his men got there before Grant, they would likely be mostly killed or captured. Too late, and they would likely run into masses of Confederates gathered to oppose Grant. On this morning of April 28, the 12th day of the raid, Grierson deferred his final decision about where to go for a little longer. Grierson could not have known, but had to suspect, the significant forces that were gathering to oppose him in west central Mississippi. John Pemberton ordered John Bowen at Grand Gulf to gather Wirt Adams' Mississippi cavalry, which had been riding patrol along the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, to prevent a surprise crossing, and send Adams' cavalry after Grierson, just exactly what the brass wanted in planning this raid. Pemberton also sent Colonel Robert Richardson with some newly mounted infantry after the Illinois Raiders. The morning of April 28, Grierson's column rode southwest toward the village of Union Church. Still worried about the railroad, Grierson sent a battalion under Captain George Trafton back east 20 miles to further break the line of the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad. After accomplishing his mission, Trafton made his way back to Grierson, only to learn the Illinoisans had been in a serious skirmish with 2 companies of Wirt Adams' veteran cavalry during the day. The fight crossed the town of Union Church, with Grierson's troops pushing the 2 companies back. It should be noticed that this is the first time that Grierson himself got into any kind of real military confrontation with regular Confederates on the whole raid. Grierson did not know it, but Adams himself was on the way to the location with 2 more companies and artillery. When Captain Trafton arrived on the scene around 3 a.m., his troopers advanced slowly with Survey scouts fanned out at the front. The scouts were taking Confederate prisoners by approaching pickets, claiming they were Confederates, asking to see the rebels' guns, then taking them prisoner. When Adams finally realized that he had Federals in his rear, he left and was last seen heading back to Port Gibson. The Union Church fight was the first real Confederate resistance, not counting Colonel Hatch's engagements after he left the main column, since the 2nd day of the raid. Grierson had to acknowledge the seriousness of his predicament. Vicksburg to the north, Port Hudson to the south, the Mississippi River to the west, and the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad to the east served to hem him in. And now the Confederates knew right where he was. The next morning, April 29, day 13 of the raid, Grierson concluded he could not delay any longer, waiting for some word on Grant's progress. Grierson knew there were rebels all around them who could annihilate his command. But in a thought process that reminds me of Grant's way of thinking, Grierson later wrote, only one thing was in the way, and that was there were two parties to that little transaction. I too understood the runways and the shortest route to reach them. I also knew the rebels, their whereabouts, and the surest ways to blind and lead them astray. So the morning after the Union Church fight, Grierson fainted toward the west and even sent a detachment toward Fayette to the west. He discussed going to Natchez with Adjutant Woodward in a room next to a prominent prisoner that allowed the prisoner to escape. Then the main column headed southeast to Brookhaven. Meanwhile, Adams' cavalry and Colonel Richardson's men were awaiting Grierson on the roads west, heading to Rodney or Natchez. Hearing there were home guards waiting for him in Brookhaven and having no time to dally with them as he had at Garlandville and other towns, Grierson ordered his men to form in column of fours and charge into town. They subdued the conscripts and townsmen and even made a few friends by paying for food with Confederate money. They also tore up more track of the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern, which ran through the town. Grierson marched his men about 8 miles south down the railroad and stopped for the night. The next day, April 30, Grant began crossing his men below Bayou Pierre at Bruinsburg. Due in large part to the success of Grierson's raid, there was no serious military opposition to the crossing. Grierson received no word of the crossing. He and his men were now 50 miles southeast of where it occurred. Grierson continued moving his men south down the line of the railroad, burning bridges as they went. They burned a train with 15 cars in Bogue Chitto. I don't know how that's pronounced. The inhabitants of Southwest Mississippi were said to sympathize with the Union, and Grierson's men found that to be true in the village of Summit. The citizens welcomed the raiders and fed them. Grierson considered pausing in Summit for a while on the chance he would learn of Grant's location and could move to join him. But ultimately, he realized the longer he stopped, the more danger his regiments would face. He finally decided to make for Baton Rouge as fast as his men and mounts would allow. The column headed south, then southwest, stopping for the night at a plantation near Liberty in, again, I don't know how to pronounce this, Amite County, Mississippi. Grierson wrote in his memoir that, quote, that night we held the forks of several important roads, on all of which the rebels were closing in on us. Besides myself, my adjutant, and a few of the scouts, our dangerous situation was unknown to the command. Grierson was not exaggerating. Wirt Adams was moving toward Liberty with 7 regiments. Colonel Richardson and his mounted infantry had joined ranks with Captain Hiram Love, the same guy that Scout Nelson had misdirected to the east on April 25th, and all were riding south. A Tennessee cavalry battalion out of Port Hudson was heading their way, as was a column of the Louisiana Legion. Another battalion of Louisiana troops under Colonel Wilburn rode north from Louisiana to try to intercept Grierson. On May 1, the 15th day of the raid, Grierson zigzagged his way back east and then south. They came across an old Mississippian who, when promised a horse and Confederate scrip, and who believed the story that the men were Confederates wearing federal uniforms taken in the Holly Springs raid, led them to a main road leading south from Osika on the Mississippi border with Louisiana. Not long after reaching the road, however, Serby rode back from his scout to report the tracks of a mounted force heading toward Walls Bridge, with which the Illinoisans had to cross to get over the Tickfaw River. The Confederates were indeed guarding the bridge. They were Louisiana partisan rangers and part of a Tennessee cavalry battalion, numbering around 100 men, led by James DeBon, a 6-foot Creole major from New Orleans. The Federals' approach was revealed to the defenders when the rear guard of the 7th Illinois ran into several rebels at a nearby farmhouse. Someone started shooting, and before Grierson could get control of the situation, Lieutenant Colonel Blackburn, who ordered Sergeant Serby and other 7th Illinois men to come with him, spurred their horses and made for the bridge. The defenders were no home guard octogenarians, and Blackburn went down with mortal wounds. Sergeant Serby was shot in the thigh, but not mortally. Grierson ordered a follow-up attack in which a trooper was killed and 3 wounded. The little 2-pounders opened fire, and the bridge was soon in Federal hands. Grierson left his wounded with a nearby farm family. He also left the doctor he had retained from Hatch's 2nd Iowa to care for the men. Someone had the presence of mind to put a Union uniform back on Serby so he wouldn't be hung as a spy. Serby recovered and was transported by train to Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia, where he was lucky to stay only 1 night and then was paroled. I presume in the continuing effort to deceive his rebel chasers, Grierson led his men east a ways, then south into Louisiana. They ran into trouble at Edwards Bridge, but fought a Mississippi battalion with no Federals getting shot. The Federal troopers then headed west across northern Louisiana to Williams Bridge over that word again, Amite River. Franklin Gardner, the commander of Port Hudson, Louisiana, on the Mississippi River, was much closer to that bridge than was Grierson when he decided to go to Baton Rouge. Granted that Gardner did not know for sure that Grierson would head that way, caution would have suggested that he send a force to guard the bridge in the somewhat predictable event that he would. Gardner did not start such a force until it was too late. Grierson kept his men in the saddle all night of May 1st through 2nd. They reached the bridge over the Amite River, the Williams Bridge, by only about 2 hours before the large detachment sent by General Gardner would have reached it. The bridge was guarded by only 2 men and was safely and easily crossed by Grierson's brigade. As Tim Smith says in his book, quote, Grierson had threaded the needle of Confederate forces aiming to capture him. The men were now within a day's ride of Baton Rouge. They had 1 more river of any significance to cross, which they did with only minor Confederate resistance. The bigger problem now than Confederate arms was exhaustion. As Grierson later wrote, quote, the last 28 hours we marched 76 miles, had 4 engagements with the enemy, and forded the Comite River. During this time, the men were without food or rest. Stephen Forbes, in an article he wrote long after the war, described the column on that last day of the march. Quote, men by the score, and I think by 50s, were riding sound asleep in their saddles. The horses were excessively tired and hungry, would stray out of the road and thrust their noses to the earth in hopes of finding something to eat. The men, when addressed, would remain silent and motionless until a blow across the thigh or the shoulder should awaken them, when it would be found that each supposed himself still riding with his company, which might perhaps be a mile ahead. We found several men who had either fallen from their horses or dismounted and dropped on the ground, dead with sleep. Nothing short of a beating with the flat of a saber would awaken some of them. In several instances, they begged to be allowed to sleep, saying that they would run all risk of capture on the morrow. 2 or 3 did escape our vigilance and were captured the next afternoon. Grierson called a stop about 4 miles from Baton Rouge to allow the men to feed the horses and rest. Most of the men took naps during the stop. Grierson rode to a nearby plantation house and surprised the inhabitants by playing their piano. Federal pickets first encountered a raider when one of Grierson's orderlies, sound asleep on his horse, did not hear the order to stop. His horse wandered into Union lines where he was closely questioned by disbelieving soldiers. Because remember, there's no way that any Union people in Baton Rouge knew these guys were coming. The ranking officer at Baton Rouge, Major General Christopher Auger, sent some of his cavalry out to investigate. Grierson rode out alone to meet them and finally convinced the fellow cavalrymen that he was who he claimed to be. Thereafter, Baton Rouge celebrated what was left of Grierson's brigade. Grierson later described their entry into town. Amidst the wildest shouts and cheers and waving of banners and flags, heralded by bands of music, the tired and travel-stained troops marched in triumph through the city, around the public square, down to the river to water their horses, and then out to Magnolia Grove, the trees of which were in full bloom and deliciously fragrant, situated 2 miles south of the city, where at sunset, scarcely waiting to partake of the refreshments provided for us, we laid down to sleep amid flowers and perfume, beside the deep waters of the great Mississippi River, without guard and without danger. So I hope you'll agree with me that this was an incredible cavalry raid, probably the most incredible cavalry raid of the Civil War. And that ends my program.
I didn't realize he separated his troops in so many different ways.
It was all part of the deception thing, because most of the time when he would do that, it would throw the Confederates off, and they thought Hatch was the main column. They thought that Forbes's 36 men were half his battalion. So the whole thing was just sleight of hand and
Explain to me.
deception, which I just think is it's incredible to read it.
Stacy, what was the name of that source book you used?
It's Sharon.
Sharon, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Well, I'll show you all of them. They're all listed there on the references. But The Real Horse Soldiers by Timothy B. Smith is probably the most modern book on the raid. I went ahead and on a whim ordered Richard Serby's book that he wrote in the 1800s. He's the scout, the Canadian who came up with the whole idea of going out in front of the battalion, and they got all this information from the locals everywhere they went, because they would say they were with Chalmers Cavalry or whatever. But he was a real incredible innovative guy. I also have this book, Roughshod Through Dixie, which came out, I think, in the 2010. And then I ordered the Blue and Gray, which anytime I do a program, I have to get the Blue and Gray, which you can still get, by the way, on Amazon. You can order. They don't come from Amazon, but they have connections. Yeah, and it's pricey, but I think they're just so good when you're studying a subject. Yeah.
Where's the grave?
It's in Jacksonville. He died in, I think, 1911. Alice died in like 1890, and the book said he quickly remarried. Some of these guys have incredible stories after the war, but I know that I have gone much longer than we typically go.
He was in the Buffalo Soldiers after.
Yeah,
Oh,
he did. He did.
I was gonna ask.
Reuben Loomis, the lieutenant colonel of the 6th Illinois, he took a medical leave of absence after the raid because it so inflamed his bad hemorrhoid problem. But when he came back, he got into a tiff with one of his majors. And the major said, I'm gonna kill you. And Loomis said, well, you've got a pistol and I don't, so go ahead and kill me. And he did. So he died like 8 months after the raid from that. Wirt Adams was walking down a street in Jackson after the war, I think in the 1880s, and met up with a local newspaper man and took issue with something the guy had written in the paper, and they exchanged words and killed each other. So I don't know, kind of crazy stories.
Other questions? Sharon, it was a great program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim Biddle,
Yes, sir.
can you give us a preview of January?
Yeah, about 1982, I think it was, moved to Butler, Missouri. And first time that I ever came in contact with the name of William Clark Quantrell. And doing for the newsletter, I'm not going to get into the gory stuff nor ghost, but what happened to him after his demise is kind of an interesting journey. He's buried in multiple places. So that's basically what kind of the whole thing of his career after his career.
That's great.
Like, where's Quantrell? Isn't it?
I'm sorry?
Kind of asking a question, where is Quantrell?
Where is he?
Mhm.
Higginsville, Missouri.
Dover, Ohio, Louisville, Kentucky, and is it Higginsville, Missouri?
Look forward to it, Jim. Thank
And
you.
I've been to all of them.
Okay. Anything else out there? Thank you very much for attending tonight. And see you Zoom only in January and February.
And what date is that in January?
Third Monday, whatever that is.
Okay. I need to make sure I'm not doing chemo or something. So,
Okay.
very
Mark it up.
good. Thank you.
Okay. Class dismissed.